For most families today, food comes from a single place, the supermarket. Every week we walk through the same aisles, fill our carts with vegetables, grains, fruit, and packaged foods, and rarely think about where that food actually comes from. But behind that convenience is a long and complex system. Food travels hundreds or even thousands of kilometers before reaching the store. It depends on transportation, global supply chains, large farms, processing facilities, and a constant flow of fuel and labor to keep everything moving. As long as that system works smoothly, the shelves stay full. But it also means that most households are completely dependent on it. Very few families today grow even a small portion of the food they eat. And when people decide to start a home garden, they often discover something surprising. Their garden produces a few tomatoes, some lettuce, maybe a handful of herbs, but nowhere near enough food to make a real difference in the family diet. The reason for this is simple. Most home gardens are not designed to produce food efficiently. They are designed for hobby gardening. But with the right planning, the right crops, and a simple system for organizing the garden, a home garden can produce far more food than most people expect. In fact, even a relatively small garden can provide a significant portion of a family's vegetables throughout the year. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in this video. A practical garden system designed not just for growing plants, but for growing food that can help feed your family. So what does a garden look like when it's designed not just for hobby gardening, but for actually producing food for a family? The biggest difference is intention. Instead of planting whatever vegetables happen to be available at the garden center, every part of the garden is planned with one goal in mind: producing the maximum amount of useful food from the available space. This usually means organizing the garden into productive beds where crops are carefully selected and spaced to make the most of the soil. Rather than scattering a few plants across the yard, the garden becomes a small but efficient food production system. In this type of garden, crops are chosen based on several key factors. First, how much food they produce relative to the space they occupy. Second, how well they store or preserve after harvest. And third, how they contribute to a balanced diet over the course of the year. This often leads gardeners to focus on a combination of staple crops and fresh vegetables. Staple crops provide calories and bulk food that can feed a family for long periods of time, while fresh vegetables supply vitamins, minerals, and variety in everyday meals. Another important feature of this system is organization. Beds are arranged so they are easy to access and maintain, often using intensive planting methods that allow more crops to grow in a smaller area. The soil is improved continuously with compost and organic matter, ensuring that it becomes more fertile with each passing season. And planting is done in stages so that when one crop finishes, another one quickly takes its place. This creates a continuous cycle of production that keeps the garden active for much of the year. When all of these elements are combined, careful crop selection, efficient use of space, healthy soil, and seasonal planning, the garden stops behaving like a small hobby plot. Instead, it becomes a reliable source of food that can support a family far more than most people expect.
Once the garden is organized for production, the next important decision is choosing the right crops. Not all vegetables produce the same amount of food. Some plants take up a large amount of space but produce relatively little harvest, while others can generate a surprisingly large quantity of food from a small area. If the goal is to feed a family, crop selection becomes one of the most important factors in the entire system. Many productive gardens rely on a combination of high-yield staple crops and fast-growing vegetables that can be harvested regularly. Staple crops are especially valuable because they provide calories and store well after harvest. Potatoes are one of the best examples. A relatively small area planted with potatoes can produce a large amount of food, and the harvest can be stored for months in a cool, dark place. Beans are another excellent crop for productive gardens. They are rich in protein, easy to grow, and can be dried and stored for long periods of time. Winter squash and pumpkins are also very productive plants. A single plant can produce several large fruits that keep well through the colder months. Alongside these staple crops, many gardeners grow vegetables that provide frequent harvests throughout the season. Tomatoes, zucchini, peppers, and leafy greens can produce food repeatedly over several weeks or even months when harvested regularly. The key is balance. A garden that feeds a family usually includes crops that provide bulk food for storage, as well as fresh vegetables that can be harvested continuously. By choosing crops that produce large harvests relative to the space they occupy, the overall productivity of the garden increases dramatically. And with the right combination of plants, even a modest garden can begin producing far more food than most people expect.
Choosing productive crops is only part of the system. To feed a family consistently, the garden also needs to produce food throughout the entire year, not just during a single harvest season. This is where planning becomes essential. Instead of planting everything at once and harvesting everything at the same time, a productive garden is organized in stages so that new crops replace the ones that finish. For example, early in the season, the garden might begin with cool weather crops such as lettuce, spinach, peas, and radishes. These plants grow quickly and can often be harvested within a few weeks. Once they are finished, that same space can be replanted with summer crops like tomatoes, beans, peppers, or squash. Later in the season, as temperatures begin to drop, the garden can transition again into crops that tolerate cooler weather, such as cabbage, kale, carrots, or beets. This continuous cycle allows the same garden beds to produce several harvests throughout the year instead of only one. Another important part of year-round production is crop rotation. Different plant families use nutrients in different ways, so rotating crops between beds helps maintain soil fertility and reduce pest problems over time. With a simple rotation system, the garden remains healthy and productive year after year. When planting schedules, crop rotation, and seasonal planting are combined, the garden becomes far more efficient. Instead of producing food for just a few weeks in summer, it becomes a system that provides fresh harvests for much of the year. Producing food in the garden is only part of the system. If the goal is to feed a family for many months, the harvest also needs to be stored and preserved so it can be used long after the growing season has ended. Fortunately, many garden crops are naturally well suited for storage. Root vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, onions, and beets can last for months when kept in a cool, dark, and well-ventilated place. Traditionally, these foods were stored in cellars or simple storage areas that maintained a stable temperature. Winter squash and pumpkins are also excellent storage crops. When kept in a dry environment, they can remain edible for several months and provide a valuable source of food during the colder part of the year. Beans are another important crop for long-term storage. When allowed to dry completely on the plant, they can be stored for extended periods and used later in soups, stews, and other meals. Some vegetables can also be preserved through simple methods, such as drying, fermenting, or freezing, allowing the harvest to be used gradually instead of all at once. By combining fresh vegetables with crops that store well, the garden's production can be stretched far beyond the main harvest season. Instead of a short period of abundance followed by months with little food from the garden, the harvest becomes something that supports the household throughout much of the year. This ability to preserve and store food is what transforms a productive garden into a reliable source of nourishment for the family. When all of these elements come together, the right crops, efficient use of space, healthy soil, seasonal planning, and proper food storage, the garden begins to function very differently. Instead of producing a few vegetables occasionally, it becomes a steady and reliable source of food. Beds are constantly being replanted as crops are harvested. Soil becomes richer every season as compost and organic matter are added. And the garden gradually becomes more productive year after year. Many families are surprised to discover how much food a well-organized garden can actually produce. Even a modest backyard space, when carefully planned, can generate a large quantity of vegetables across the growing season. With the right combination of staple crops and fresh produce, the garden can begin to supply a meaningful portion of a household's diet. Of course, the goal is not necessarily to replace every item from the grocery store, but producing even part of a family's food at home can reduce dependence on outside supply chains, improve the quality of the food being eaten, and create a deeper connection with how that food is grown. Over time, a garden designed for food production becomes more than just a hobby. It becomes a small, resilient food system that supports the household year after year. And it all begins with a simple shift in perspective, designing the garden not just to grow plants, but to grow food that truly sustains the family. When all of these elements come together, the right crops, efficient use of space, healthy soil, seasonal planning, and proper food storage, the garden begins to function very differently. Instead of producing a few vegetables occasionally, it becomes a steady and reliable source of food. Beds are constantly being replanted as crops are harvested. Soil becomes richer every season as compost and organic matter are added, and the garden gradually becomes more productive year after year. Many families are surprised to discover how much food a well-organized garden can actually produce. Even a modest backyard space, when carefully planned, can generate a large quantity of vegetables across the growing season. With the right combination of staple crops and fresh produce, the garden can begin to supply a meaningful portion of a household's diet. Of course, the goal is not necessarily to replace every item from the grocery store, but producing even part of a family's food at home can reduce dependence on outside supply chains, improve the quality of the food being eaten, and create a deeper connection with how that food is grown. Over time, a garden designed for food production becomes more than just a hobby. It becomes a small, resilient food system that supports the household year after year. And it all begins with a simple shift in perspective, designing the garden not just to grow plants, but to grow food that truly sustains the family.